So we'll start tonight with an apology for those who will watch this online. Devil truly in the wires tonight, and I could not get my PowerPoint presentation to download on my computer, which is how we wind up getting the presentation to the TV with an HDMI cable. So for everybody in the class, they get the joy of seeing it on the TV screen like they always do. And then sadly for others, it'll be like it was a few weeks ago where we have a camera pointed at the TV. And I'm sad to say I don't know how to work that software program that Steve has on his laptop that can get that series of bars out of the corner there. So apologies, and we will try our best to work through all of this and get this straight next week. So no one's fault tonight but mine. Anyway, so for those of you in attendance tonight, we are just going to be doing chapters 13 and 14, which doesn't seem like a lot. And, pending your questions. Yeah. Pending your questions, it might not be all that much, but we'll start off with just a reminder that Isaiah chapters 1 through 12, kind of its own microcosmic gathering of a picture of what God is going to be doing with Judah, Jerusalem. And in a collage of pictures, we see very heavy-handed judgment. We have little to no question about how extreme and the measure of finality that's going to come with this, but with just about every movement of judgment that's given, we also have a keen picture of restoration with, in some cases, subtle, in some cases, little more than subtle hints of how this is not only going to include just ethnic descendants of Abraham, but a much more expansive picture. And places we would pull from would be like Isaiah chapter 9 or 11 with respect to a child being born and the governments of the world at large being on his shoulders. And of course, Isaiah 11, the pronouncement that he is going to be the banner that will be lifted up first for the nations. And then after that is mentioned, we have the promise that he will also be the banner for the ingathering of Judah and Israel as part of a new Exodus movement, which brings us now to the end of chapter 12 with the victory song, paralleling what we saw last week with the victory song that Moses and the Israelites sang after their deliverance from Egypt, with respect to the forecasting of a picture of the restoration of God's people and the nations being attached to them through a new Exodus phase that's going to draw everybody out of the exile of their sin. And of course, with that, we understand Judah and Israel, being like the nations they are firmly embedded amongst, have become like them, and because they are like them, they are going to be thrust out into exile where the nations have been for centuries, since the time of Babel. But this new Exodus, again, are going to pull all of them out of that. And now, when we get to chapter 13, it stands to reason we're going to be embarking on something of a new journey with respect to what Isaiah is going to be picturing for us. So, just to kind of spoil a little of this for you now, chapters 13 through 23 are going to be taking a look at the nations that in large part surround Israel, but we should be thinking of Israel in the sense of the united kingdom under David and Solomon, because many of these nations are going to be touching the borders of the northern divided kingdom that is Israel, and of course kingdoms that are going to be touching the southern border of the kingdom that is Judah. But Isaiah's framework in some cases looks at these people as two divided kingdoms, or in many cases Israel is just one people. And so if we're looking at it from the perspective of the land still being united and all of these kingdoms, with exception to perhaps Babylon and Assyria being their neighbors that they share borders with, it will make a lot more sense, okay? So tonight we're just going to be covering two chapters that deal exclusively with Babylon. Now, if you remember where we have traipsed through so far, we started chapters 1 through 6 during the time of Uzziah. 7 all the way up through 12 have mostly been dealing with Ahaz, but we're not done with him yet. In fact, it's going to be in some of what we'll discuss tonight that Ahaz dies, and that's another occasion for Isaiah to mark the death of a son of David and all of the implications that come with that, not just the vulnerability of a kingdom that probably has a co-regent already in place and a firm successor identified, but just the turmoil that comes from the changing of hands and heads that wear crowns and so forth. In fact, that's part of the reason why he actually mentions that, because of what's going on with Philistia at that particular moment. But all that to say that it also measures out the level of punishment that's being given to each and every one of these descendants of David. That they, like every other human being, are marked for death. And of course, death in and of itself is the judgment for sin. But with these particular movements from Uzziah, Jotham, and then Ahaz, and eventually Hezekiah, but we're not there, we are seeing Assyria as being the dominant power player. And so if Assyria is still the dominant power player, then why would we start chapter 13 with an indictment, an oracle? The actual Hebrew word is a burden against Babylon. That would be a fair question for us to ask. If we're paying attention to the way that these chapters in this collage form are being stitched together, we've really had no mention historically of Babylon. And so if Babylon has not really come to the forefront yet, and we're going to wait for Assyria to eventually fade out of the picture, Babylonian dominance to start to rise to the point where they can challenge and then eventually conquer Assyria, you would expect this to come as a much later development in the book of Isaiah. In fact, it's going to be around chapters 37 through 39 that we're going to get that particular moment and that point of historical synchronization where Hezekiah is being mentioned and that threat of Assyria coming into play. And then, of course, the defeat of Assyria in the land. And then with that, the promise that Babylon is going to eventually come someday and conquer them, which leads us into chapter 40, a whole new division of Isaiah. So if that's where we kind of start to see Babylon show up in the historicity of Isaiah's focus, then why in chapter 13 are they starting to take center stage with 2 whole chapters dedicated to them? These are the kind of questions that we should be asking when we're looking at a scroll like Isaiah and appreciating the artistic nature of the fabric and the design of this picture that the prophet's painting for us. All right, so with some preliminary questions in place, let's try to jump right in. Every one of these slides are going to be titled, Judah's Hope Rests in Yahweh Alone. And I'm telling you that now because I want to spoil this for you, and I probably will use that as my slide title for the next several weeks as we work through the chapter material of 13 through 23. And the reason for that being is because if we're asking the question, why in the world, when you consider Israel as a people, and I'm just writing I and J to represent the 2 divided kingdoms, but again, as a whole people, why in the world, if they have been the target of God's judgment that he has pronounced through Isaiah, are we now starting to talk about all of these surrounding kingdoms? What does any of that matter to the Lord? Because these are not his covenant people. A couple of things. Remember, back in chapter 7 starts with God telling Isaiah, take your son, Shear-Jashub, go to Ahaz. And when he finds Ahaz, he sees him completely frantic, inspecting things like the water security and various other provisions that will need to be made and whatnot. And he tells him to be quiet, to calm yourself, or to do not be afraid and do not do anything hasty or brash that would not be in line with what God is about to offer you. So we have a frantic king that's worried about all the intelligence reports coming his way with verified evidence that armies are amassing. Israel's enemies, namely Judah's enemies, are gathering at her borders, chopping or licking their chops to come in and to try to conquer her. And they already have their nefarious plan spelled out with the deposition, or I keep saying the wrong words, his disposition as king, and then installing a new puppet king. So we know how that story plays out. Ahaz already has an idea in place. I'm going to make the big gambit, and I'm going to go get Assyria to come and take care of my 2 northern threats. But it doesn't bode well for him in the end. All that to say, Judah as a kingdom is incredibly vulnerable. She's small. She has really no way of handling any of these formidable foes that would come and challenge her. The only saving grace they've had in the past has truly been God turning her enemies over to her in battle. And usually that happens before the skirmish even reaches its pinnacle, where the army is doing its best, fighting as hardest as it can, because God has went before them in battle and orchestrated the scenario such a way that it's clear God delivered victory into their hands against an overwhelming and overly sized force that they just are not evenly matched against. So that to say, Judah as a kingdom would be wise in the eyes of all the other kingdoms around her to orchestrate treaties and to make these as ironclad as possible, to do something like Solomon did, and to marry foreign women, the daughters of all of these kings and dignitaries, to ensure that peaceful relations are maintained between her and all these other kingdoms. But in every one of these kingdoms that surround her, that would be easy allies, that if one kingdom decides to become the imposing threat, then another kingdom around her could easily come to her aid just by literally amassing her armies and coming right across the border and meet that threat before it can muster. But God is telling them, as he had already warned centuries before through Moses, you do not do that. You do not make treaties with any of these people. And what better way to make sure that every one of them would think twice before second-guessing God as to, well, okay, but how do we know that Moab's not going to be able to help us? Because Isaiah is pronouncing that Moab's defeat is coming soon. What about Ammon? Same thing. What about Egypt? I mean, come on. Egypt has been around as a kingdom for centuries now. Surely she has the wealth, the power, the might to check a kingdom like Assyria. They don't either. And so in spelling the doom that is on the horizon for every one of these kingdoms, it literally leaves, if we're thinking about them being pawns on a chessboard, now knocked over, Judah and Judah alone, standing with every reason to be trembling, considering the big bad, Assyria, that's going to be coming to check her soon, but knowing that God is the biggest kid in the playground, or on the playground, and no one can challenge or rival him in power. So if we maintain that operative mindset as we're working through these chapters, I think we'll have a pretty good understanding of why we have this corridor of 10 chapters that are neatly divided with 6 kingdoms on one side, 6 kingdoms on another side. And I don't mean 6 kingdoms geographically spread out. In fact, let me just erase this here so that way it's not a distraction. But we have chapter 17 right in the middle, and the end of chapter 17, we have a generalized pronouncement of God's judgment over all the nations. And so with that, we have these 6 kingdoms here, these 6 kingdoms here, and they'll all wind up experiencing the same sort of edict of judgment that Isaiah is going to be pronouncing. Now, I can't really give you a good understanding as to why some kingdoms only have a handful of verses, 5 or 6 dedicated to them, and then he moves on, versus a kingdom like this that has 2 whole chapters. It has nothing to do with the size of the people, because when we move beyond chapter 14, we get into 15 and 16, which are all dedicated to Moab. Moab is nothing in size compared to a kingdom like Babylon, so why in the world do they get 2 chapters? Whereas Egypt just gets a little byword in the middle of a chapter that's surrounded by edicts pronounced against other kingdoms. Again, I can't give you a good sound reason for why that is, but it's what we will enjoy as we work through this. All right. So, a pronouncement concerning Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw. Just as another little brief rabbit trail moment, remember I taught you that at the beginning of chapter 1, we have this rather similar phrase of these are the visions concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw. And we did not get that for chapters 3 all the way up through 12. Now we are getting this phrase again, and we will not have it again until we move outside of chapter 23. That's not to say that it's going to come in chapter 24. We may get something new on the other end of that. But this is one way of helping us understand. This is another compilation or a collage that's tacked on, stitched in to the end of 12, that's moving into a new set of themes, but they're still bringing up the very themes that have already been embedded for us in chapters 1 through 12. Make sense? Good. All right. So I would say for a moment, let's just ignore this. And here's the reason why. By saying ignore this, I mean let's ignore the fact that we are told this is a pronouncement concerning Babylon. Part of the reason is because, number one, this is an editorial comment, okay? That Isaiah did not write this down saying a pronouncement concerning Babylon. All right, this was something that was added in after the fact to help as part of the effort in compiling these visions to make sure that the reader understands who exactly is being talked about here, because some of these we will see as we progress from 13 through 23 are going to have names assigned to these kingdoms that are familiar to the original readers and hearers of these messages that are not to us, and that translation committees have had to add as footnotes in our study Bibles to help us understand this word means these people, okay? So when we have a superscript there or a heading, that is to help focus us on, hey, we want you people who are reading this after the time of Isaiah to understand these are the people he was actually referring to. And if we do that, if we put this aside for the second and we just start as if verse 2 is really verse 1 and let the drama and the tension build in the text, eventually we'll arrive at the understanding that he is talking about Babylon. So I'm not saying let's ignore that as if to entertain the idea. Maybe this is somebody else. But when he was speaking this oracle originally, it would be with the understanding that he is putting people on the edge of their seat, asking themselves, who is he talking about? Like he did with chapter 5, starting with the Song of the Vineyard, saying, shall I sing you a song of my vineyard? And it starts out great with all of these things that God did to plant his people, and they would understand themselves being the vine that he planted and dressed so well to get this fruit from. But then he goes on to talk about how this actually turned out with the stinky grapes, and then pronouncement of what he's going to do to completely dismantle the vineyard, right? So he is building the tension and the suspense in there that when they arrive to the end of it all, they clearly understand we are in a sad state and in a desperate place with trouble surrounding us, or it's on its way. So with that in mind, if we start with verse 2, let's see where we go with this, all right? So notice in verses 2 through 3, we've got plural pronouns here. Call out to them, signal with your hand, and they will go. Oh, by the way, we are told to lift up a banner on the top of the mountain. There's nothing significant about this mountain. Throughout Isaiah, you will hear the phrase often, my mountain or my holy mountain. This is just a barren mountain. It would not be a wrong thing for us to be asking, well, what has happened to this mountain? Why is it completely bare? Has it fallen under judgment itself and been completely stripped of everything? No, that's just to simply mark out the fact that as opposed to a mountain that's completely covered in lush green, thick foliage, where if you were to try to stand on the top of that, shrouded in shrubs that are probably equal to you in height and stature, or trees, and you raise a banner, what's the likelihood anybody's going to see that? But you stand on a completely clean landscape of a hill or a mountain that's raised out of that and stand there with the banner, then anybody can see you in any direction. That's the idea, because peoples are going to be coming from every direction to amass on this rallying point. So call out, signal with the hand, they will go through the gates of nobles. To say they will go through the gates of nobles certainly seems to suggest, if we're talking about amassing an army, that they are going to be coalesced for the clear purpose of conquering, and their journey or venture will be successful if they are going to walk through the gates of nobles and claim cities as their prize. I have commanded my consecrated ones. Now that's interesting, because to say that something or someone has been consecrated means that they have what? What's that?
Been chosen.
Yeah, they've been chosen. They have been marked out for a clear purpose. We would use this as priestly language for the most part of the Levitical and priestly classes. However, this is being spoken of with respect to an army, which is not foreign, because God chose Israel as an army that he would make his instrument of judgment and warfare against the tribes of Canaan, and they were consecrated for that purpose. He says, yes, I have called my warriors. All right, so with that, the next question should be, who are these people? Remember, we're ignoring verse 1. We're asking, as if we're going into this completely blind, who is this? Because in some ways, it certainly sounds like it could potentially be Israel as a candidate, but it could be anybody at this point. So who is God going to be gathering together, and better yet, for what purpose? Obviously, war, but against who and why? Why is war being declared? He says, who celebrate my triumph. Now, that's a bit misleading, because what that really means is, instead of, because when you read that in the CSB, what you might have as your word picture is, this could very well be Israel. If we're ignoring it's Babylon, and if I just gave this to you sterilized of any actual names of people, and you had to guess who this could be, my consecrated ones who celebrate my triumph, and this is the Lord speaking, then naturally I would be thinking, well, this must be Israel, because nobody amongst the nations worships God. And so with that, only these people would be dedicated to celebrating the triumph of the Lord. However, what we understand, if we go back to the Hebrew, is that this word, celebrate, means gavah, or gabah, majesty or pride. And from Zephaniah 3:11, he speaks about, I will remove your arrogant and haughty people, using the same word in that context to describe both Hebrew and gabah, which would also be the same word that Hannah uses when she says, do not talk with loud, proud, boastful words, or do not talk gebawah. Again, same word. So the idea then is that it's not necessarily an army who celebrates God for his wondrous works and his triumphs in the past, i.e. Israel. This is an army that's chosen by the Lord, and they are his exalted, arrogant ones, would be a more faithful rendering of what that phrase actually means, which totally changes the picture then and puts us right back into guessing, well, who could this be? And it very well may not be Israel. And they are to execute my wrath. Listen, a commotion on the mountains like that of a mighty people. Listen, an uproar among the kingdoms. So remember, I just every now and again want to pull this tactic back out to make sure that we understand. The vast majority of Isaiah is written with poetical prose as its primary means and device of communicating these messages. And with that, we need to make sure that we are understanding the concept of the parallel thoughts. So line 1 and 3 of verse 4 are speaking of the same thing. Commotion on the mountains, and the commotion on the mountains is the uproar of kingdoms in plural. So we go back to the original understanding, barren mountain, banner, as the rally point for who? It's these kingdoms that are coming to coalesce together for the purpose of now becoming one consolidated army, and we know it's going to be bent on conquering and creating commotions on the mountain, commotion on the mountains, because they are indeed a mighty people, nations being gathered together. So from verse 4, line 1 and 3 together, and then line 2 and 4 together. Maybe that will do a better job of explaining what I perhaps have failed to explain very well in the past, as goes the concept of how Hebrew parallelism works. Anyway, lastly, the Lord is mobilizing an army for war. So we must ask, when Yahweh mobilizes an army, and he points that army at an objective, when they go into combat, what is that process called? Or basically, what is the overall conflict being categorized as? Think of Israel as a nation under Joshua going into the land of Canaan, and what they do against the Canaanites. That all falls under the umbrella of what?
I mean, they massacred the people.
That's true, massacred.
They take over everything.
And so with that, of course, skeptics look at that and they question, how could a loving, benevolent, holy God sanction such a thing when he created all mankind to express his image? But the thing is, the Amorites obviously, and not just the Amorites, all of Canaan for that fact, but they seem to be targeted more than anybody as the chief clan, that the Amorites are obviously a wicked people, and we are told that in Genesis 15, that Abraham's people are going to have to go off into exile and slavery for 400 years because the sin of the Amorites has not yet met its full measure. But when that time comes and God is ready to give them the land, it's going to come at the expense of the Amorites and all of these Canaanite tribes along with them. So if God is marking them out for judgment and he uses another army to come as his tool of judgment, then what God is declaring against the people who are the targeted group that will experience judgment is what? He has declared a what? Maybe you think of it in terms of the Crusades, right? The kings of Europe wanted to go and claim the Holy Land again because the Saracen armies had infiltrated it and claimed all of those sites for themselves. And they're, of course, treating Christians with terrible tyranny and so forth. So these kings and the popes of Europe were declaring what against the Muslim armies? A holy war. A holy war. So if God mobilizes an army, he amasses them. he points them to a particular target, then what he is declaring in essence is a holy war. But the question then becomes, who is God declaring holy war against? Let's see. So now verses, I think it's 6 through 9. I didn't put the numbers on the side of the screen, unfortunately. But, well, because the day of the Lord is near. Hey, brother, glad to see you can make it. I got your text earlier, so I know it was probably a bit of a struggle to get here, man, so I appreciate the effort. As I do for everybody who's here. The day of the Lord is near. And we get it again, close down to verse 9. Look, the day of the Lord is coming. So something of an inclusio. Remember, an inclusio is a phrase, very rarely a word, a phrase that is given, if not verbatim, very, very close in structure that tells us the information included between them is all pertaining to the same thought. Now, we've seen the concept of the day of the Lord being mentioned before, right? We go back to Isaiah chapter 2. Verses 1 through 4 is the pronouncement that Jerusalem is going to become the sacred spot for all of the world to come and worship, where people will river up the mountain and they will hear the wisdom the Lord gives, and then his word will proceed forth out of Zion as the people river back to their ancestral lands, presumably, or wherever they will go to. The idea is that basically all of the world is treating Jerusalem as if it's its capital, both religiously and politically. But then when we move through the remainder of the chapter, 5 through 22, we have the pronouncement of the day of the Lord. Now, remember, chapter 2, naturally coming after chapter 1, and the superscript we have at the beginning of chapter 1 is the understanding that these visions pertain to Judah and Jerusalem. So this day of the Lord that's being spoken of in chapter 2 would rightly go against Judah in Jerusalem, okay? So if we've worked through that already in chapters 1 through 12, then who exactly is this day of the Lord being focused against? Remember, we're not paying attention to verse 1 at this moment. We're still asking, man, God is amassing people for a holy war, and this could be his people, one might think. Who exactly is he pointing the Israelites toward for holy war, and who is now the target of God's next day of terrible, notable judgment? And we learned in Isaiah 7 as well, remember, this all comes against Judah and Jerusalem, with Assyria being the primary holy army, if we would use that term, that God is using as his consecrated force to target and execute his wrath and judgment against not only Israel as a northern kingdom, but also the southern kingdom, Judah and Jerusalem. What's up, man? Now, as we move through verses 10 through 13, we get a picture of what this calamity is going to shape up to amount to. I want to be very careful not to say this is what it will look like, because one thing I would have us notice in all of this is, remember, this is poetic language. It's figurative. It's not to be understood, especially in a hyper-literal type of way, because if we strain it to that extent, then things quickly start to fall apart if we would just utilize a little bit of common sense as goes asking the question, how can this be, and how does it not contradict other parts of Scripture that we've already worked through? Case in point, indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shine. How can the sun be dark when it rises? That doesn't happen. This is not speaking about the moment of an eclipse. Okay, it's speaking about the clear fact that the sun, when it comes up and peaks its early rays over the eastern horizon, there will be no light to be given. And the moon, obviously, on its path to set over the western horizon in its fuller phase of 3/4 to full, obviously is going to be still radiant at that time of the morning, where you could potentially see both in the sky at the same time and the moon still giving its light. Neither of these chief heavenly luminaries will be shining at all. This is not a natural phenomenon that's meant to be understood here, all right? So the question then might be, is this a judgment that the army of Yahweh is bringing? In other words, if we're going to take this down out of the rafters with respect to the idea of it being hyper-literal, but instead, in some way, giving us a feeling and a visual representation of sorts of what this devastation will mean for these people, that will experience this wave of judgment that he has spent the last 9 verses talking about. Is this the judgment that they're bringing? Not that they're going to be causing the stars in the heavens not to shine, or heavenly luminaries in the literal sense of sun and moon not to shine. But what do we understand these kinds of things to represent symbolically in Scripture? Number one, Scripture itself, especially the Old Testament, is firmly embedded in the world of ancient Near Eastern literature. So that means even though we consider it oftentimes as its own separate work, and it is because it has nothing to do with any of the rest of those works that are contemporary to this particular time or times before it. Yet, when we look at other sources of ancient Near Eastern literature with their creation myths, their flood myths, we see many kinds of things like this, in which kings are spoken of as being heavenly luminaries, that they are the morning and the evening star, that they are the sun in its embodiment, not in the sense that it's the actual disk in the sky giving light down to earth and its occupants, but the sense that the sun god is their chief patron, and because of that, when the sun or the king rises, the sun rises because the king got out of bed. That's their way of thinking. And they understand that there is not a literal connection to such a thing, but it's the idea that there is a deep and very heavily and intimately intertwined connection between the physical and metaphysical worlds that we in our time just laugh at and scoff, like, we're more scientifically endowed. We certainly understand these things aren't like that, right? But we have to understand it from their perspective, okay? So if to say that this is a judgment that's going to cause the heavenly luminaries, and you can't see me on the screen, but I'm using air quotes, heavenly luminaries not to shine, and we're thinking that this could be a veiled reference at political leaders and key figures such as kings and generals and whatever else might be, for them not to shine, and we're speaking in the language of conquering and conquest, then that means one army comes to decimate and the opposing or challenging army that gets wiped out loses all of those people. And usually these kinds of battles end with kings being executed and their kingdoms assessed into the spoils of the conquering king. All right, so all that to say, if indeed, then who or on who is this judgment coming? And next question from verse 11, when he says, I will punish the world for its evil. So this is day of the Lord judgment, or language. Oftentimes when we read these sorts of passages, we start to conflate the idea that this is going beyond the realm of what the author is originally describing or talking about, and speaking about the day of the Lord in its final measure and final manifestation, meaning the last day of the Lord, when he returns, judges all sinners, wipes the world clean of all unrighteousness and wickedness, and permanently establishes himself to rule and reign over the cosmos with a renewed humanity, ruling over a renewed creation along with him. That day of the Lord is coming, but every time we speak of the day of the Lord in any of these prophetic books, we're looking at Amos, Zephaniah, many others alongside Jeremiah or Isaiah here, that we're not supposed to just jump straight to that end of the spectrum and think this is what he's speaking about. Because to do that is to cut this out, amputated and bleeding from its original context, and forget how it's attached to what it's already embedded in. So we're asking the question, who is the army? Who are they coming against? What is this judgment going to look like? And when he says, I will punish the world, what does he mean by that? Does he mean the world in the sense of every human being on the planet, no matter where we're talking about, outside of the biblical purview of any of these authors and what landmass they know exists? Or are we just talking about the world that they know exists and the nation and people groups that they know currently populate the planet? All right? And we have to, in most cases, go back to the original Hebrew sources, because at times the word we get for world in English is a different Hebrew word from another one that's used to be translated into world. It could be tabil, which in often cases would be the entire planet, but not always. Or it could be aretz. And with that, that could be world, or it could also just simply be land. And there's a big difference between the globe and a patch of land, right? So in this case, it actually is tabil. So that would make us think, okay, so is he talking about the entirety of the globe and everybody on the planet? Or again, we still have to ask the question. In the age of empires, which is a new thing coming on the horizon for Isaiah with respect to Assyria and what they've done, and what he is now talking about with respect to Babylon, and Babylon taking over Assyria and everything that they control, which means the entirety of the Mesopotamian River Valley, all of the connecting landmass between Mesopotamia to the Levant, which is the nations of Phoenicia, Israel, and then eventually Egypt, right? And then parts of northern Arabia. That's more land than any kingdom has ever controlled in the past. For them, that is the world in its entirety. You never hear anybody in the Bible talking about any other known people group or civilization outside of those people until we get to the New Testament era and we speak about those peoples west of there in the age of Rome and beyond, right? And if so, who will survive? Because if it's a world-ending and world-consuming judgment, then, well, that's a fair question. Look in verse 12. I will make a human more scarce than fine gold. But that seems to be somewhat problematic when you consider he's going on to talk about making the heavens tremble, the earth shaking from its foundations. A little aside, brief rabbit trail. I'm going to take a few steps and then come right back to the main trail, I promise. But remember, when we talk about the world and its creation, and the biblical vantage point of any author, it is always the three-tiered universe. And I know you can't see what I'm drawing on the dry erase board if you're watching this at home, but I would encourage you to just simply Google three-tiered universe Hebrew Bible, and you'll come up with a dozen pictures that will give you much better representations than what I have. But with that, you've got the dry land, and this is where everybody lives. Below that, you have Sheol, or the abyss, which is usually separated from this by waters that are subterranean. Then you've got the firmament, and in the firmament, you've got the sun, moon, and stars that glide back and forth every day. And above this, you've got more water, and on top of that, you've got God's temple, or his cosmic mountain. To say the world is being shaken from its foundations is as if to say these pillars are cracking and everything's falling. So with that, there's nothing left. There isn't even space for people to continue to live if it doesn't survive this cataclysm, which again, as I hinted at, creates a problem when we consider going back to Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10. That's the verse we alluded to earlier. That on that day, on the Lord's mountain, when Jerusalem becomes the epicenter of the world, the Spirit bringer, or the branch on whom the Spirit rests, is going to stand with a banner, or as the banner, both, for the nations to come and rally to, and those people who were scattered of Judah and Israel to the nations. Okay, so if these two things align as being simultaneous, then how in the world, if humans are so scarce, they are going to be as fine and as rare as gold from Ophir? Are we going to have a throng of people that we would still consider nations, or even the dispersed exiles of Judah and Israel, who will be able to river in great populous groups up to the summit of the Lord's mountain? These are conflicting images. So they would cause us then to question, which one should we follow? Well, if this is day of the Lord judgment being spoken about here is not really meant to be understood in that hyperliteral sense of humans are going to be extinguished or become so rare like that of the fine gold of Ophir, but more so that it's speaking in these judgmental terms of war and conquest, and usually when something like that happens and a whole kingdom falls to another and those people are assimilated into the conquering kingdom, usually we've got massive waves of slaves being carted off, obviously countless casualties from those who fought in the war, and then when the conquering troops come pouring into the streets of the city and they're putting everybody they can find to the sword until eventually their bloodlust is assuaged, and then they stop taking lives, at least in the sense of killing people, instead carting up slaves. And usually, like in the days of Jeremiah, leaving just the poorest of the poor who can barely fend for themselves or couldn't survive the journey or aren't worth trying to sell, being the people who can guard this ash heap of what's left. All right? So if that's the case, it takes us out of the clouds of the idea of the entire world being burned to cinders and back to the idea of a people that is the target of God's holy war that he's using an invading army to challenge. Jeremiah is another prophet who uses this language a little bit more succinctly when he says, speaking of the time when Babylon is going to come and conquer Jerusalem. At that time, it will be said to this people and to Jerusalem, a searing wind blows from the barren heights in the wilderness on the way to my dear people. It comes not to winnow or to sift, a wind too strong, for this comes at my call. Now I will also pronounce judgments against them, meaning against his people Jerusalem. I looked at the earth, it was formless and void and empty. I looked to the heavens, their light was gone. It's using the same construct as Isaiah. I looked at the mountains, and they were quaking, foundations of the earth stuff, right? And they were shaking, and all the hills shook. That sounds like an earth-ending cataclysm, does it not? But this is framed up in the concept of Jerusalem being laid siege to and then ultimately destroyed by the Babylonians. I looked, and there was no human being. All the birds of the sky had fled. I looked, and the fertile field was a wilderness. That puts us in the context of Genesis 1 and 2, with God making the dry land and then settling the man in the garden temple, and he planted him there firmly. All of this, per Isaiah 5, has now been torn apart. There is no man. There is no field. There's nothing. It's as if we've taken the beautiful picture at the crescendo of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and now we've gone back to Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, where the earth is formless and void and there's nothing but chaos, right? But again, this isn't the world. This is just Jerusalem. For Jeremiah, this is the center of his world, and it has been stripped from him. There is no place to call home anymore because it's just a pile of stones. Blood still stains the streets. Cries can still be heard as people are holding the lifeless carcasses of their loved ones, right? It is world ending. So it's not to over-exaggerate as much as it is to paint a beautiful poetic picture of, man, this is how bad it is. All right, so now that we've kind of worked through that a bit, moving on to verse 17, he says, look, I am stirring up the Medes against them. Again, if we've ignored verse 1 and paid no attention to the fact, as if we did not have that information, that this is an edict or a burden against Babylon, and we're like, who is this? This is the first named kingdom we have. But he's stirring up the Medes against them. So obviously, if the Lord is stirring up the Medes, they must be the holy army. Now, who exactly is the target of the judgment? Who cannot be bought off with silver, who have no desire for gold, on and on. Verse 19, and Babylon, the jewel of the kingdoms, the glory of the pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. So now we know who the referent of the coming judgment is. So it just solidifies what we have in verse 1, okay? But we've appreciated how the author has built suspense in this to get us up to the point of who, what, why. We're still kind of waiting for the why somewhat. But nonetheless, when we appreciate the fact that it will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them, we are compelled then to reference that story in its context, Genesis 19. But when God rained down sulfurous brimstone and fire, what do we have from the actual context? Then out of the sky the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, burning sulfur from the Lord. He demolished these cities, the entire plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and whatever grew on the ground. So was there anything left of Sodom and Gomorrah? So to say then that the Babylonian kingdom, the jewel of the kingdoms, is going to become like Sodom and Gomorrah, and of course, all the language that we just walked through with stars not shining, moon and sun not giving their light, earth shaking off of its foundations, mountains quaking, all of this stuff, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Come on, it's October, people. Give me a smile. Ghostbusters. I know you all know that movie. Anyway, that would certainly hint at the idea that if it's like Sodom and Gomorrah, that there will be nothing left of Babylon. But what actually happens? What happens is a wee bit different, at least in the sense that when the Median kingdom, aligned with Persia, conquers Babylon, which we find that story given to us in Daniel chapter 5, that every night, or that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was killed. Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. And for all that history cares about or records, he's the only one that died that night. There was no conquering siege laid to Babylon. The beautiful brilliance of the efforts of the Persians and Medes working together was that they dammed up the Euphrates to allow themselves to go underneath the walls that were built there to infiltrate the city. Probably killed a few guards, but certainly once they killed the king, that's it. The show is over. There's no reason for anybody to contest them. The city is literally theirs. So because they did not raise the walls and the towers to the ground, and they didn't put everybody to the sword and start carting people off as slaves, but instead they appointed their own king to rule over what is now the newly minted Persian district of Babylon, and continue to utilize this kingdom as a fully functioning center of, or section of, the Persian Empire. That seems to go a little bit against the grain of what we just read here with respect to the full-on decimation of Babylon. So does that mean that we should not take Isaiah's words at face value? And I'm not even saying hyperliteral, I'm just meaning at face value. Did he misspeak in saying that these peoples are going to eventually be annihilated? No. It just means that it's part of a phasic process. Because eventually Babylon will become a sand-covered, ruinous heap, such that centuries after its own demise, when no one lives there except for the wild animals that just trek across the sand above it, does someone like Saddam Hussein have to send excavation crews out there to actually start raising some of the walls up out of the desert sands for the world to see and appreciate, and of course to vaunt his own pride in, right? So all that to simply say that it does happen. It just doesn't happen quite the same way that it's measured out by Isaiah, which does not cause us to challenge those words with skepticism, but to understand that God's purpose begins or is inaugurated in a way that sometimes isn't fully understood, but looking back on it gives us a clear indicating signal it's begun, and then when it reaches its measure of finality, you can say, yep, that's exactly what the prophet said would happen. He goes on to say in verse 21, desert creatures will lie down there, owls will fill the houses, ostriches will dwell there, wild goats will leap about, hyenas will howl in the fortresses, and jackals in the luxurious palaces. Babylon's time is almost up. Her days are almost over. For it to become a ruinous heap that the sand dunes eventually cover would certainly speak to the idea that eventually it becomes the haunt of jackals. It gets there just in the process of time, which is on par for how God does things, is it not? Christ comes to inaugurate the kingdom. He begins the process of renewing creation by renewing us first, the very last elements that he created during creation week. That's going to work up to the culmination of all of the cosmos being renewed once he comes to fully dwell amongst us for all time, uniting heaven and earth together. But we live in the tension between those 2 points. We have no idea how long he's going to drag this out until that happens. All right. So speaking of hyenas and the haunt of jackals, the reason why authors will employ these kinds of pictures like this is not to just simply give us a picture of what the decimation looks like. But again, while we may not realize it, it's actually a veiled allusion back to the creation story itself. After all, we go from complete total chaos and disorder, in which there is nothing but water covering all things, and the Spirit of God hovering upon it to bring order from the chaos. And that picture finishes with dry land covered in vegetation, hedged out garden, king, queen, priest ruling in the middle of it, walking with God in the garden, listening to his wisdom, and heaven and earth dwelling together in harmony, right? And man is put there to name the beasts and to rule over them as God has assigned them under his dominion. So he is king regent over planet Earth. But for the places where men live, which the first, if you will think of it in this way, a city or garden temple, which was Eden, eventually, while they are driven out of it and it's destroyed by the flood, becomes resurrected in a sense with human ingenuity and building cities. Tower of Babel story is a great example. It's meant to recapture Eden just on the wrong terms. God drives them away from that, but what does human civilization do? Flourishes still and continues to build cities. Cities where at the end of all things in the book of Revelation, we see a city coming down out of heaven. God does not decry cities as being evil. God seems to celebrate in them as being not only an achievement of human ingenuity that gives him glory, but a place where he and man get to meet together as much as they did in the garden. All that to simply say, when cities are completely thrown down, walls torn apart, and now humans do not live there anymore, but wild animals have consumed the place, it's a picture of devastation that takes the image of complete perfect order and harmony in Genesis 1, turns it on its head to show us we're back to the picture of complete chaos. So man has lost dominion. And this is exactly where Jerusalem is headed for. And Isaiah, speaking about Babylon now, is foreshadowing that they are going to become the key power player that's going to challenge Assyria And in doing so, they become the nemesis and bane of Judah and Jerusalem during Jeremiah's day a couple of centuries later, when he says this of them in Jeremiah 9:11, I will make Jerusalem a heap of rubble, a jackal's den. I will make the cities of Judah a desolation, an uninhabited place. So any questions so far? That's chapter 13. No? We good? All right. Chapter 14. Now, if you're familiar with chapter 14, because you're just a total Bible nerd that loves looking at abstract things that just kind of catch your eye from time to time, you might be that kind of brand of Bible nerd that's like, I want to know everything about angels and demons. And naturally, this would be one of those places you're going to go to because it's part of where Christianity as a whole has built a theology regarding the personage of who we call Satan, okay? So we're going to be looking at some of these key passages. I want to forecast that now because I don't want you to realize it when we're halfway through it and be like, oh yeah. So if you can start thinking about some questions now that you might have in the remaining almost 30 minutes that we have, start formulating them so that way when we get to it, I'm sure others might appreciate it too. All right. So we'll just read these verses 1 through 2. For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob, and he will choose Israel again. He will settle them on their own land. The resident alien will join them and be united with the house of Jacob. So yet again, another clear sentence given us some foresight as goes God's agenda of how he's going to incorporate the nations in with Israel as part of his grand plan of Exodus. The nations will escort Israel and bring it to its homeland, and the house of Israel will possess them as male and female slaves in the Lord's land. They will make captives of their captors and will rule over their oppressors. Let's work through this. So in saying the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and choose Israel again, we've already had multiple spots in the previous 12 chapters with all those verses splashed up on the screen that show us a clear understanding that while judgment is coming, we have seen from multiple angles through the prism here what restoration is also going to look like, and that indeed he is not done with them. Shir Jashub is right there on Isaiah's side or flank when he is moving up to Ahaz, and without having to say a word, yet the clear understanding being for the reader, this son's name means to this king who is frantic about the oncoming onslaught of challenging and opposing armies that a remnant will survive, a remnant will return. So he will settle them on their own land. And again, when we look at places like Isaiah 7 or 11, the idea is that they are going to coalesce around God's holy mountain. Now, of course, if we're looking at this from a vantage point of eschatology and the idea of how everything is trending toward the ultimate climactic moment of God's return and what the fallout of that's going to be, there are multiple camps that people find themselves in. For those who take that hyperliteral stance, usually in the dispensational premillennial camp, bless you, we'll see this as an understanding that when Jesus returns, per Revelation 19, that he is coming to establish David's throne and kingdom in Israel once again, for these people to be resettled there and to live for the duration of the 1,000 years in the confines of this space as it's newly allotted to them, probably following in Ezekiel late chapters 44 through 48 kind of schematic. I think chapter 47. But all that to simply say that when we work through the rest of this at the end of verse 2 here, and the idea that the nations are going to be ultimately responsible for bringing the captives or the dispersed of Israel and Judah back into the nations, and then Israel will be given this place of prominence in which they will take their captors and make them slaves, and they will rule over them, so that the oppressed now become the oppressors in a sense. This is what gives rise to the idea that there are two separate and distinct entities as goes God's end-time purview and his plan or agenda for them, and what's ultimately going to become the fate of the nations. And we don't have time to go into all of that, but I will say this should be something of a point of challenge to that, as goes what Isaiah has already said, what he will say through the rest of this book, and a lot of New Testament literature and theology that has to bear on this as well. Let's keep working. So the resident alien will join with him, be united with the house of Jacob, again forecasted in Isaiah 11. Succinctly, verses 10 and 11, banner lifted out to the nations. They're going to rally to him, the new shoot that springs off of Jesse, covered and indwelt by the Spirit of God. And to say that they will make captives of their captors and rule over their oppressors, I think in some way can allude to Deuteronomy 15, where Moses says, if you are faithful, you will be the head, not the tail. You will lend to many nations. They will not have to lend to you. You will rule over many nations. So in a sense, corporate Israel becomes like a new Adam. And as Adam in the garden context was assigned dominion over the world, so Israel will have dominion over the nations. But never once is it spelled out that you are going to rule over them the way a tyrannical, empirical king rules over his conquered subjects and treats them as second-class citizens. If anything, they are reminded over and again, you are to treat the foreign resident, the alien dwelling in your borders, as if he is you, as if he is one of you, from which we get the words of Leviticus chapter 19, love your neighbor as yourself, because you don't have a different set of scales for them. You don't have a different set of laws for them. The only way they are separate from you is they don't get to join in the festive cultic moments of, say, Passover or any of those high holy days, because they are not ethnic Israel. If they want to become ethnic Israel, they can, and then they can join in that. But in everything else, you accord them the way you would your own father or brother. There is no distinction. So why then is this upended to say that now, because they have been oppressed, like they were in Egypt, by the way, you don't do that to the foreign alien or resident because you were slaves once. You know what it was like to be treated like that, so you don't treat them that way. Would he abrogate that here to say you were sent out into exile because of your sin, not because they come against you and conquered you, and I couldn't do anything about it? You sinned. I turned you over to what you wanted, which was exile. I've brought you back, which is not what you deserved, to then say, and now I'm going to cause the nations to suffer by putting them under your boot for you to rule over them as slaves. It's the upending or turning on its head of a paradigm. Now, how many times do you see that happening in Jesus' way of framing up the kingdom? Oh, you want to be the greatest? Well, guess what you get to do? You get to serve everybody. You want to be first? Well, guess what? In the kingdom, the first are last, and the last will be first. That comes from places like this, where in the context of kingdom, everything that is the normal power structure and grid of the day is completely inverted and turned upside down, such that the oppressors can become, or the oppressed can become the oppressors, but not in the way that oppressors were treating the originally oppressed people. It's as if to say, you don't have the power anymore. That's all that means. All right, moving beyond that. So I've got two passages plastered up on the screen here, but if you'll notice, the first one on the left hand ends at 11, and the next one begins at 16. So we're going to get to that middle passage here in a second, but I want to point out some parallels between these things. So he says, again, this is chapter 14, so it's still dealing with Babylon, but this is drilled down more microscopically to the king of Babylon. So this is a dirge or a song of lament of sense sung about him. So the first one I would point us to is verses 8 and 17. So notice it says in verse 8, even the cypress and cedars of Lebanon rejoice over you, meaning your fall, saying, as if they were given voices, since you have been laid low. And to say laid low would put the king of Babylon almost in their context or on their playground, to say, like you were a tree, and now that you have been chopped down with an axe, like you do with us, no lumberjack has come against us. Now, what's that to say? Well, apparently the king of Babylon has pillaged the forests of Lebanon, which, oh, by the way, several of these ancient Near Eastern kings contract with the kingdom of Phoenicia to get those cypress logs from their forests because they are very beautiful and ornate. We see them polishing not only David's palace, but the Lord's palace and Solomon's as well. How many other kings of the day, right? So no doubt he was perhaps pillaging it for not only decorating his palace, but maybe even for its sturdiness and using it as siege works against these cities he's going to conquer. Because when the king of Babylon comes, he's not crossing over the Euphrates River and the north end of Israel to just simply come down to Judah. He is conquering a whole bunch of other people along his way. Before he even gets to Judah, he puts Egypt in the corner in a bit of a timeout when he beats Pharaoh up in Carchemish, and then he comes down and conquers Judah, and then he goes to lay waste to Egypt to make sure that while he's over here, he'll just kill as many birds with one stone as he possibly can before he finally packs it all back up. It takes months to get back to his hometown. Verse 17, though. who turned the world into a wilderness. So think of it like that. Cutting down the trees, stripping forests bare. Same thing in verse 17, but now more expansive, turning the world into a wilderness, who destroyed its cities, which is literal for what the king does, and would not release the prisoners to return home, because like the Assyrians before, carts people off to repopulate other areas of the kingdom with these newly deported subjects. Verse 9 and then 18, stirring up the spirits of the departed for you. I guess it makes sense if we read the first part of verse 9. Sheol below is eager to greet you for your coming, stirring up the spirits of the departed for you. All the rulers of the earth, making all the kings of the nations rise from their thrones. And then in verse 18, these kings of the nations, they lie in splendor, each in his own tomb. But what we'll go see after this is that this king does not. We're not going to get to that thought yet. Instead, verse 10 goes with verse 16. They, all of these rulers, respond to you saying, look, you become as weak as we are because we're dead. We're disembodied spirits. We're the Rapha or Rephaim down here in the abyss. And we, without body, have no influence in the world to govern the affairs of men. And guess what, bucko? You don't either, Mr. Big Bad Emperor that controlled whole entire kingdoms and more land than any other king has ever ruled over before. You are as weak as we are. Now, verse 16, those who see it, you will stare at you. They will closely look at you, and they will say, is this the man who caused the earth to tremble, who shook the kingdoms? How unimpressive is he standing before us now without all the pomp and circumstance that he has been stripped of. And verse 11 kind of also ties into the previous thought from verses 9 and its connection to 18. Your splendor has been brought down to Sheol along with the music of your harps. Maggots are spread out under you and worms cover you. And you are thrown out without a grave like a worthless branch. Branch tying back into what the cedars are saying to him, that, hey, since you've been laid low, you're like a worthless branch, covered by those slain with the sword, dumped into a rocky pit like a trampled corpse, as if to say, you had no name in life, you have no name in death. No one knows you here, you mean nothing. What could be any more humiliating for a man of such stature? But now I show you this to say, especially when we look at verse 16 with that question, is this the man who caused the earth to tremble, who shook the nations or the kingdoms? That verse coming off the heel of what you now see on the screen, because this is the passage that oftentimes is touted, marched out front and center as being a proof text for this is who Satan was prior to him becoming who we call him now. So, beginning in verse 12, shining morning star. What we need to understand is that word or phrase, Hallel, just means a shining one. You might ask, how do we even get the name Lucifer? No, you can't see what I'm writing on the board there, but I am just simply writing the name Luciferio. That is the Latin equivalent for the Hebrew word shining one. So it is a word that if it was to be used in any other context would simply mean that. But along the process of transmitting the scriptures and eventually translating them first into Latin, that became the dominant version in Western Europe for the next 1,000 years up until the time of the Renaissance, when the fall of Constantinople happens, and then by virtue of that, a flood of manuscripts that came from the originals of Greek and Hebrew documents that were obviously the original tongues that the biblical documents or books were written in, came flooding into Europe, and we have all of these people like Desiderius Erasmus looking at this and saying, you know, there's some variances here. What we see in Greek doesn't quite match up verbatim with what is said there in the Latin. And so with that, some of these words, through translations like the King James and some of its predecessing English equivalents and whatnot, have survived to this very day, and a theology built around it such that we create the construct of a person whose name was literally Lucifer, that was an angelic deity that lived in God's heavenly realm until he decided to rebel against God and led a rebellion of other angelic beings against God, such that God now had to kick him out. But if this is embedded between these two passages of Scripture, that is a lament clearly speaking, as it does in verse 16, about a man who causes the nations and kingdoms to shake because of the terror that precedes him, knowing that when Babylon comes, who can challenge the might of Nabopolassar or Nebuchadnezzar or whichever one is ruling at that time? It is not speaking of an actual angelic being that existed in heaven that challenged God's authority and chose to rebel. Let's work through this more. How you have fallen from the heavens, you destroyer of nations. You've been cut down to the ground. Notice how when it says destroyer of nations, connecting it already to what we've connected to before in verse 16. They'll see you, stare at you, they'll ask, are you the one who shook the nations? You've been cut down to the ground, connecting to verse 19. You have been thrown out without a grave, like a worthless branch, covered with those slain by the sword. He says to himself, I'll ascend to the heavens, I'll set my throne above the stars of God. Now, when we look at the idea of stars of God, we can pull from a place like Job as one of a handful of scriptures that give us a clear indication here that stars of God are a little bit more than just the actual stars that illuminate the night sky. Job says of this, or I should say the Lord says to Job in Job 38, who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God, Ben-Ha Elohim, shouted for joy. These are, in essence, one and the same, part of God's countless throng of holy ones that he surrounds himself with. So these are indeed heavenly creatures that we're speaking about here. So it's as if to say this particular entity wants to rise above them. But if Lucifer was an angel, how is he going to rise above a crowd that he's already standing amongst as an equal to? Does that make sense? I want to be the chieftain over them. I want to reign over them all. Okay, I'll sit on the mount of the God's assembly in the remotest parts of the north. What does this mean? Remotest parts of the north. In your study Bible, you might have a footnote there that says this is meant to be understood in the Hebrew construct as Mount Zaphon. This is a literal place. If this is Israel, the whole land, Mount Zaphon is way up here. And guess what? In Canaanite mythology, just like Mount Olympus is for the Greek pantheon, Mount Zaphon is the dwelling place of the gods. This is where Baal hurls his lightning bolts from. This is where he brings the storms from. This is where he copulates with Asherah at. So if this is the dwelling place of the gods, and this person or being is wanting to say, I want to ascend to the remotest parts of Mount Zaphon and to become the chieftain over the stars of the heavens, which again, ancient Near Eastern literature, these are the servants of the gods, or in some cases, like planets, they are the gods. This is where they reign. This is their abode, three-tier universe kind of stuff. That there is a connection between what's above the firmament, in the firmament, and on these high sacred places like Mount Zaphon or a Mount Olympus. It's just simply say, I'm going to become the chief of the pantheon. That's all that means. It's not saying, as if this is an angelic being trying to rebel against God, to have himself then kicked out of heaven. You might say, well, wait a minute. Verse 14, I'll ascend above the highest clouds and make myself like the Most High. Again, in Hebrew, that is El Elyon. Guess who the actual chief of the pantheon is? El. And another phrase for him is El Elyon. That's the exact word that Balaam uses in all of his oracles to describe the God of not only Israel, but Canaan as well. And there are several extant documents from this particular time period that show that to be the case. It is a clear Canaanite descriptive term for the chief of their pantheon. And it is borrowed and incorporated into Hebrew because Hebrew, like Canaanite, is a Semitic language. It's only natural then, just like any other language would have a word for God, if we translate the English word God into whatever it is for them, that's the word they would use to call that particular entity that we worship. All that to simply say, I hope this is somewhat demystified now, and this is moved out of that camp of trying to create a theology for who or what Satan is or was, and helps us firmly understand all of this cohesively talks about the king of Babylon and how terrible his fall is going to be, and how in the process he is going to be humiliated and desecrated because he chose in his exalted vanity to ascend to the chief position of all of these pantheons. Because as he, like the Assyrian emperor, is moving through the world and conquering kingdoms and overcoming their gods, and then asks that question, you remember them, you remember them, you remember them? Did any of their gods stop me? Do you think your gods or your God will stop me? No. They are nothing to me. I will rule over them all. Your gods are going to be pleased to hand you over to me. It's sometimes the biting sarcasm that they give when they taunt their enemies. All right. So we're about to finish the chapter up. Assyria is going to be destroyed. This is brief. We've already looked at this. very top of the screen there, almost in the upper right corner, is where the Assyrian Empire is. Got a new map up there. But anyway, I just want to point out in verse 25, I will break Assyria in my land. I will tread him down on my mountain. In a lot of ways, this is actually what will happen. It's actually foreshadowing the language that's going to be given to us starting in Isaiah 36, where we synchronize with history again, and we actually have the moment of Hezekiah, son of Ahaz's distress, when Assyria has now moved through the land as a swarm of locusts and conquered everything else, waiting to take Jerusalem as their last and final prize. But when Hezekiah goes into the temple, he prays, he beseeches the Lord, beckoning for his mercy, and then Isaiah comes to comfort and give guidance. That night, an angel comes and decimates an army of nearly 200,000 people. So when you're a king, you got 200,000 guys, almost, lying dead on the ground. Do you have much of an army to pack it in with and take it back home? I mean, think about the casualty rate of any of the wars we fought in modern history or slightly pre-modern, or certainly during the campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars. That guy went through armies, like babies go through diapers. I mean, casualty or soldiers were hugely expendable to him. And it's amazing to me how this guy could go and challenge an army on the battlefield with 20,000 soldiers, maybe lose that conflict, run away from that, sometimes leaving his own soldiers and commanders on the battlefield to go and muster another army of 150,000 guys. Where did they come from? I mean, if you had them before, why weren't they out here, right? But I mean, to raise massive, huge armies, nonetheless, though, in the ancient Near Eastern landscape, to lose that many soldiers would be a hugely devastating blow. And, all things considered, it actually ends even worse for him, because we're told in Isaiah 36, which is corroborated in Kings, one day while he was worshiping, this being Sennacherib, worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer struck him down with the sword and escaped to the land of Ararat. Then his son Esarhaddon became king in his place. So the Assyrian king is decimated not only on the battlefield, in the land of God, right up next to the mountain of God, but then when he goes back to his hometown, God's vengeance follows him and he is executed by his own sons. And of course, this causes us to look back to the promise of Isaiah 10, where he says that, therefore the Lord God of armies says, my people who dwell in Zion do not fear Assyria, though they may strike you with the rod and raise their staff over you as the Egyptians did. In just a little while, my wrath will be spent with you, and my anger will turn instead to their destruction. And on that day, his burden will fall off of your shoulders and his yoke from your neck. And in some ways, it did. Now, of course, Judean kings are going to continue to be subject to them, rolling that over on into the conquest that Babylon will bring once they dominate Assyria and then start to exert their power and influence in this part of the land. Last section. A pronouncement against Philistia. Now you might be wondering, why, if through 13 and 14, if we've been talking exclusively about Babylon, do we now transition in this almost disjointed way to Assyria? I can maybe grant Assyria because it's like Babylon is going to assimilate them when they conquer them. Well, if we're going to use that thought process, then the same can be said for Philistia, because Philistia will have to face down Babylon as well, and they will be decisively conquered in the battles of Ashkelon and Gaza. And once they rebel the last and final times, trying to lean on Egypt for help, Egypt will crumble, not even come to their assistance. And when Babylon conquers, we will never hear of Philistia again in recorded history. They are no longer a people, even to this day. So anyway, he says to them, in the year that King Ahaz dies, this pronouncement came. Remember I said at the beginning of the lesson, this is one of those moments where he mentions the death of a son of David. Now, this will be important, because if you think about it, from the days of David, Philistia has for the most part been subject to the kings of Israel and then Judah, right? And somewhat the northern territory as well, because Philistia will share a northern border with the northern kingdom of Israel. And there will be brief spurts where Philistia will exert a little bit of dominance on the western borders. Uzziah will come and kick them all back and even conquer some of their territory and claim it for himself. But then during the days of Ahaz, they'll get some of that back. There's always the changing of hands of certain things. But for the most part, Philistia is never anywhere near as dominant as they were in the days of Samson all the way up through the period of Saul as king. And then David shuts them up and puts them in the corner and subjugates them as part of a perpetual ongoing timeout of sorts. So now for the son of David, Ahaz, to be dead, he is telling them, hey, don't rejoice. The rod of the one who struck you is broken. So who's the rod in this sense that struck Philistia a while back and has continued to strike them and keep them under boot all this time? Good guess, but not quite. And this is the reason why it's important for us to make sure that we stop and ask questions, writing them down and thinking, okay, I think this. Let me see if the rest of my understanding of the text backs that up, or is there something else that gives me a reason to think that might not be them? I heard another answer. Don't be scared now, just because I said no to Bobby.
Yeah, I was wrong. That's one less.
Well, let's think about it. So King Ahaz dies. So now they're rejoicing at the time of his death. If they're rejoicing at the death of a descendant of David, and we're talking now about the rod being broken, then who then do you think the rod might be? The house of who? The house of David, right? So no doubt, he is indeed the rod. Now, perhaps part of what's going on here is Philistia is sending emissaries over to the kingdom because Hezekiah, who has probably been co-regent for a while and is now the sole ruling monarch, they're coming to him to say, hey, maybe we can ease up a little bit of some of the tribute that we have to pay, or certainly, hey, Assyria, big baddie. We want you to help us, and we will help you. We'll put our differences and age-old conflicts aside. We need to be consolidating strength and resources, because when they come down here, because at this particular time, there is no northern kingdom anymore. So with that, there's nobody else between Assyria or Israel and Aram to help, and it's us in Egypt. And if we don't align now, we're all going to fall separately, right? Anyway, so he goes on to warn them that, hey, I'm looking now why I linked this in here. I linked verse 24 of chapter 10. Therefore, the Lord God of armies says this to my people who dwell in Zion: do not fear Assyria, though they... the parallel idea here. That Assyria strikes them with a rod and raises their staff over Israel, like Pharaoh did in Egypt when he struck them. And when he is using this term or phrase here, the rod of the one who has struck you is broken, is as if to say, it's kind of alluding back to the same Exodus picture that we have in Isaiah 10. In case I'm not making sense, let me just rework this for a second. Isaiah 10, we're talking about the decimation of Assyria, the promises to Judah and not fearing them. Assyria has been like a Pharaoh in raising the rod over you and struck you, but I will break his rod, and you don't have to worry about him anymore. And I will stretch my rod out like I did over the sea and parted it to bring you through that. I will provide deliverance for you. Now, in saying to Philistia, yeah, the rod of the one who struck you is broken, but instead of it being a source of deliverance for them, it's an assurance of the fact that defeat and their doom is on the horizon. Because notice what he will say after this. A viper will come from the root of a snake, and from its egg comes a seraphim, or a seraph, a flying, burning serpent. Then the firstborn of the poor will be well fed. Before we get to verse 30. Coming from the idea of a viper coming from the root of a snake. When we start the whole Exodus picture with Moses in Egypt and he is confronting Pharaoh, when he confronts Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's like, show me a little something. What does he show him? He turns his staff into a snake. So with the mention of rod being broken and then a viper coming from the root of the snake, do you think that there are some embedded hyperlinks here that could be alluding back to the Exodus story? It very well may be. And if that's the case, then when we move to verse 30, the firstborn of the poor will be well fed. What was the fate of the firstborn? The only time we have the concept of firstborn being mentioned in the story of the Exodus. Well, there are two groups of firstborn, right? So the firstborn of who dies and the firstborn of who lives.
Firstborn of all that they didn't put blood over.
That's right. The firstborn of all the Egyptians died. Firstborn of all of Israel is preserved. But the speech here seems to be alluding to the idea that the firstborn of Philistia the poor of Philistia will be well fed. So again, those people that Philistia, like any other society, would count out as being nothing, who cares if they die, right? Because they don't contribute to anything. They're just a drudge on society. But the poor and oppressed, the outcast, which is always seemingly the center of God's heart, are the ones who will be well fed here. Then he goes on to say, the impoverished will lie down in safety, but I will kill your root with hunger, and your remnant will be slain. So, wail, you gates, cry out. It's interesting to say, we've kind of got this Passover picture here of the idea of, again, Exodus with snakes coming from rods and rods being broken, but don't rejoice over that because this broken rod is going to turn to a snake and strike you down. And then the same thing with the idea of firstborn being preserved, but only of the poor, like the oppressed in Egypt were, while you, the haughty, high-minded ones, he's going to destroy you down to the very root. And on the Passover night, when the people begin to wake up and realize their houses are filled with dead people, what begins to break out in the land of Egypt? Wailing, crying, right? So we have the same thing here. He tells them to wail. The cloud of dust is coming from the north. This is obviously the invading horde of Babylon. No one missing from their ranks. And what answer will be given to the messengers from that nation? It's simply this: deliverance can be had for you, but it will only be in Zion. Philistia, your fate is tied to the fate of God's people. And the only measure of grace that will come to you, the only taste of mercy you will get, will be what mercy God provides for his own people. But thankfully, the prophet has told us that that mercy too is reserved for the nations. So, any questions on that?
All right, so he was telling the people of them people.
Yep.
That if they went to Zion, that they'd be saved, or no. It was over for them, no matter what.
I think so. I really think that's what he is hinting at, because the Lord has founded Zion and his oppressed people find refuge in her. It's easy for us to always read when it says his people, that we're only thinking in a very close-minded, narrow way. This is only ethnic Israel that he's covenanted with. But if we're paying attention to what the prophet is saying, has been saying already, but will say many, many, many more times through the remainder of this book, his people will come to include those who are called by his name, which will come from all the nations. So this potentially then can be an extension of his delivering grace to them if they come into Israel and become part of this throng of people who will river up the sides of Zion, where God dwells, where his wisdom presides, and is to be given to the nations. So what will be framed up as the final choice that everyone will have to make when we get into Isaiah 61 through 66, New Jerusalem is coming, and the servant that he has carved out as his consecrated one to shout this message to the nations and preach to the captives and all this, you've got the choice. Do you want to be a part of the New Jerusalem or not? If you don't, then you'll be a part of the ash heap that's left on the outside. That's the only choice you got.
You know, it kind of goes back to, like a few weeks ago, you know, something or other about the rivers going up, flowing up.
Uh-huh.
All the people going to Mount Zion, Zion's on top of a mountain.
Yep.
Mountain. Everybody coming up of it to get refuge.
That's right. Exactly. So if you're starting to pick up on those clues, and where have I seen this concept of refuge before, right? And of course, over a book that's as expansive as Isaiah is, it's easy to lose track of these things. So that's why I always encourage, when you're studying this kind of stuff out, Stenopad or whatever you're using to make notes on, and write things down. Circle them, stars beside them, you know, refuge in Zion, here, and I see it here, and I see it here, and I see it here. And what does it mean? Because not every place where that is mentioned do we have the more expanded concept of this belongs to the nations, not just Israel. Sometimes it seems like it's just Israel, and the context really makes it clear. It really is just Israel. But in some cases, too, it's beyond just ethnic Israel. It's also everybody. So it's not either or. It's all the same. Remember, prism. We keep turning it, keep getting different angles of this stuff every time we revisit it. Any other questions?